Hello, my name is Jessica Podoski. I'm with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Honolulu District, and my presentation today will be on the climate change vulnerability assessment conducted for American Samoa with a focus on transportation infrastructure. I'd like to thank my co-authors for this presentation, Dane Sherblum and Shelley Franklin, both of HHF planners. A brief outline of my presentation is I will go over the study background and an overview of the methods that were used to conduct the study. We'll talk briefly through the topics of the transportation asset inventory that was done, the assessment method and the vulnerability index that was used to score many of the assets, the social vulnerability work that was completed, some of the stakeholder engagement that was done, as well as some of the adaptation concepts that were discussed. And American Samoa is a U.S. territory. It's a group of 5 islands that's about 1,600 miles or 2,600 kilometers northeast of New Zealand. And it is, like many Pacific islands, very geographically isolated. It has very limited natural resources, and that makes it very reliant on its transportation infrastructure, such as harbors and airports, to bring in all fuel, commodities, and other important resources. Specifically for climate change in this study, we will be focusing on sea level rise primarily as one of the main climate hazards. And sea level rise in American Samoa, due partially to land subsidence caused by a 2009 earthquake, is about 8.9 millimeters per year, which is much higher than the global average for sea level rise. And in this case, if this continues, they will have 3 feet of sea level rise from present day by 2065. So it's rising rather rapidly. So this was a first look at climate change vulnerabilities in the territory. It was not intended to be an all-encompassing study, but it was a first look at some of the adaptation measures and vulnerabilities and what planners and decision makers need to be looking toward the future. So this is a typical village in American Samoa. You can see that it has a very narrow coastal plain that's backed by very steep topography. All of the infrastructure is located, all the roads and harbors and as well as the airport are located usually right along the coastline, as shown here. And this really limits the options for adaptation to climate change and sea level rise specifically, because retreat or relocation is a very difficult prospect for American Samoa. The goals of the study, as I've mentioned, are to look at transportation infrastructure specifically, harbors, airports, and roadways, and use stakeholder engagement and consideration of social vulnerabilities to inform a vulnerability assessment of these transportation assets for the government of American Samoa, specifically the Department of Public Works. This study was completed by the Corps of Engineers for Department of Public Works. They received a grant from the Office of Insular Affairs and requested that the Corps of Engineers complete the study, and we reached out to our industry partners at HHF Planners to help us with that. The study products were a report that includes all of the items that I've previously listed, including adaptation measures, order of magnitude costs, and a summary of the work that was done, in addition to a GIS geodatabase that collected existing and new information for use, hopefully, in future studies, which I'll mention again later. And the map here to the bottom right is just an example of one of those GIS maps that was provided as a product. The assessment method uses the U.S. Department of Transportation Vulnerability Assessment Scoring Tool, and that is just the process of compiling asset inventory data, looking at different ways to assign vulnerability indices, then for those most vulnerable assets, looking at adaptation options, and of course providing those recommendations to decision makers at the end, and it's an iterative process. So the transportation assets were inventoried by collecting information from Department of Public Works for roadways and Department of Ports for airports and harbors. And this is a map that is compiled of all the major and minor roadways. The main harbor on Tutuila is the Pongo Pongo Harbor, and then there are small boat harbors, 4 or 5 small boat harbors around the island. The main airport is there on the middle of the island of Tutuila, and there are also smaller airports. So that was just the inventory of elevations and assets. The vulnerability analysis completed for the transportation assets was done using many different factors, some of which were sea level rise inundation areas at 3 feet and 7 feet. Those can be shown in the map below in the red and purple areas. The AE and VE flood zone areas, the amount of developable land areas, and that is what this map is indicating. The red areas are showing areas with a very steep topography that are not developable, whereas the green areas are areas where the topography is more flat and can be developed. So we considered villages that would lose a good significant portion of their developable land with sea level rise inundation to be very vulnerable, and as well as proximity to an eroding shoreline. So these factors were brought together and scored in a vulnerability index. A social vulnerability analysis was also completed for each village using U.S. Census data to determine factors such as age, gender, occupation, education that would make a certain village population more or less resilient to the impacts of future climate change. So that was factored in to the study as well. Quite a bit of stakeholder engagement was done as part of this project. We held 2 workshops in American Samoa. The first was in June of 2019. This workshop was really a kickoff workshop intended to bring together the important stakeholders, share the data and information that we had, and collect data and information that they had already completed for our study. It was attended by many federal agencies such as NOAA, National Weather Service, EPA, and many others, as well as territory agencies such as Department of Public Works, Department of Ports, Department of Commerce, and Coral Reef Advisory Group, and several others. We went back and had another workshop in October of 2019, and this workshop was really more of a working group where it was intended to bring together those stakeholders and discuss the assets that had been identified as most vulnerable and look at some of the adaptation concepts that were possible and get community and village feedback on those concepts. So this was attended by those federal agencies and territory agencies that I mentioned, as well as the Office of Samoan Affairs, territory senators and representatives, as well as some village mayors, in addition to Congresswoman Aumua Amata, who is shown in the picture on the left. So as many people who work on climate change vulnerability know, there are basically 3 major adaptation approaches: relocation, elevation, and protection. Relocation is moving the assets away from the most exposed areas. So this would be moving an airport or runway inland, anything that's a critical facility, moving it. As I mentioned before, there are land ownership and tenure issues in American Samoa that make this a challenging proposition, as well as a very limited amount of developable land. The next adaptation category is typically elevating. This is where you take the elevation of structures to move them out of a sea level rise inundation area. So roads, revetments, culverts, and other engineered structures that exist along the coastline can be elevated. The challenges to this are these can exacerbate the flood risk in some situations or move it to a different location. And finally, protecting, and that would be either providing shore protection, some sort of environmental restoration or enhancement to reduce the inundation due to increased sea levels. And the challenges to that are we often have a lot of natural resources in our nearshore areas. So each one has its own set of challenges. The adaptation strategies that we looked for all of our most vulnerable areas, American Samoa, ranged from revetments to replacing or upgrading culverts, elevating parts of the road, creating seawalls, and softer measures such as reef enhancement and vegetation planting. And we came up with very rough order of magnitude cost estimates per mile for each of these features and applied those, and those were based on project histories and a literature review. So I just wanted to show one example. We looked at many villages, many of the most vulnerable villages, the airports and locations in American Samoa. This is just one example where we sat down at the workshop, really looked at the issues, the areas that were vulnerable, and what type of adaptation measures could be placed. So this is specifically one in the Tafuna, Nuuuli area where the airport is located and is very exposed to about 3 feet of sea level rise. So for this particular example, we proposed reef balls in one area, a revetment along a certain part of the shoreline, and some redevelopment of the airport to elevate it and get it out of the coastal flooding area. And we looked at some very rough costs to provide just for planning purposes, except for the airport relocation that was beyond the scope of the study. So in summary, as I mentioned, this is a first step for the territory to pull together some of the existing data, identify some of the data gaps, and really get together the stakeholders and decision makers to start thinking about what's going to be required for climate change adaptation, specifically for transportation infrastructure in American Samoa. So we looked at the transportation infrastructure, identified what was most vulnerable, came up with some adaptation concepts, strategies, and some rough order of magnitude costs. So this is by no means a comprehensive study. It's really a first step. We provided that GIS geodatabase that can be leveraged for future studies. And as part of the study, we also made a list of 12 recommendations for future work that involve more economic analysis, looking at methods to elevate wharves, many other suggestions that you can read about in the report. So thank you very much. Again, my name is Jessica Podoski with the Corps of Engineers Honolulu District, and I would like to thank everyone for your time in listening to this presentation.